Okay folks, now we're ready to start talking about how to begin your coil bowl. So I've got my bowl here with some saran wrap in it. I've got my cookie ready to go. I've got my extruded coils. A couple other tools I have is a serrated rib. That's a rib that has an edge on the other side, or a sharp edge. You could also use a fork. I've got a little container with water with a sponge and a needle tool. So those are just a couple other tools I have available. The first thing I'm going to do is start with a basic coil. So I'm going to take my cookie of clay and I'm going to measure around that cookie of clay to create my first coil. Once I get to where the snake bites its tail, I'm going to trim that, and I can kind of trim that so that the snake bites its tail in sort of a nice way here. Now, for slipping and scoring, that's where the serrated rib and the water comes in. I don't actually have any slip here. I'm sort of cheating a little bit, but I am going to score, and I'm dipping in the water, and that's creating the mud or the slip. Now I'm kind of scoring on the edge of my cookie and a little bit on the top, like the top 1/4 inch of that cookie. So I'm really sort of muddying that cookie up so that this first coil will stick. Now the coil itself, I don't bother slipping and scoring, but where I do slip and score it is where the coil meets. Again, I call it where the snake bites its tail. That just makes sense to me. Oh, come here, little snake. So I'm going to go ahead and notice I'm not building this inside the bowl yet. The first coil is sort of the most important in the fact that if your bowl is going to crack anywhere, it's usually right here at the bottom. So you guys know that the inside of this bowl is going to be smooth. So my next step is, notice I don't have a bunch of slip or even any more water. I'm just using my thumb and blending some of that soft coil into the cookie until I can no longer see that gap. So I'm blending that clay down. And for this first coil, I'm not only going to blend the inside, I'm going to blend the outside too. Again, this is the bottom of my bowl, and I don't want this to separate in the kiln when it gets fired. So I'm going to blend back and forth. Now, if I feel like I need to add, a little bit more clay into that gap, sometimes if your coil is pretty dry, this process is hard. So notice my coils that are sitting on the side, I've been spraying them with water as I'm working. You could also drape a damp paper towel over them so that they're not just sitting there sort of drying to oblivion as you're doing this detail work. So that's the bottom of my bowl. This is sort of the top part of my bowl. And now I'm just going to sort of shape it back into more of a dish shape, because this is going to start to be built in here now. Now I want to really press this in and make sure that it's fitting the bottom of my bowl. So I can use my knuckles, I can use a kind of a wet sponge, but sort of press this in and make sure that that first coil is sort of resting on the side of your bowl. What you don't want to do is start building something that kind of starts to be a tower up the middle. The whole idea is that you're pressing, again, the saran wrap sort of getting in your way, but you're pressing into the sides of the bowl so that you get a nice uniform shape. I want to talk a little bit now about some different coil techniques. Of course, I could just do another band around and around, kind of like this bowl, but honestly, this gets really boring really fast. So if you want to do maybe one more coil that's just around, like a stripe, that's fine. But what gets fun with coils is the other techniques we can do. So the first one I want to show you is called a snail, and it's kind of the most basic one. I tried to sort of create a template here. The snail is kind of what you see in a lot of coil bowls. It's just like a coil, or a spiral, if you will. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to kind of thin out my coil a little bit. So I'm going to start in the middle, kind of roll towards the edges, and just make it a little bit thinner. The ones that come out of the extruder are sort of thick, so I'm going to just thin it out a little bit. Then I'm going to start on one end, and I'm going to start to roll this up. And I'm going to make a bunch of these, and I want them to all be sort of the same. So what I do is I sort of do it like an assembly line. I get one up there so I can kind of see how big is this thing, and then kind of do a second one that matches, if I can, and sort of try to make them all the same size as I go. Now, if I was going to do a row of these around the bowl, I would need quite a few. So Again, the easiest way to do this is sort of an assembly line. So hopefully you can kind of see this in my video. And kind of taper this edge before you roll it or spiral it. And this is what I call just a basic snail. So this is the one I find that a lot of kids do. It's pretty simple to do and it goes pretty quickly. So I would definitely encourage you to have maybe a row of snail. You want to think about your pattern on your bowl. So we're going to talk about an artist, Maria Martinez, who was a really amazing and famous kind of ceramic artist she was a Pueblo Indian. She did a lot of design bands on her bowls. So now that I've got a few of these, I want to start to kind of lay them in my bowl and figure out how that design band is going to work. Are they about the right same size? I have one that's a little bit bigger here, so I might trim that guy. He's a little long or thick or something. I'm going to try to even that out. And I'm going to just kind of lay them in there and go, okay, do I like the way that's looking? Do I have enough to go all the way around? You can see I need a few more. So I'm going to do that. And that can be one whole design band for me. The next thing I want to do is fill in any gaps. So what comes next after your kind of first design band is really raindrops. Raindrops are basically little balls of clay. They are tapered on one side, so I'll show you that. Let me get a couple more snails going here so I have a full row of snails for you to show. And raindrops are a good sort of filler. So I'm just laying my snails. I'm kind of making sure all my snails sort of face like the same direction and try to fit them all in here and make them look nice. Okay, so now you can see I've got some gaps here. Hopefully you can see that in the video. And that's where I need to start making some raindrops. So raindrops, just take your coil, cut the same size little just chunk with your needle tool, make it into a ball. The little, like measuring it out, just make sure they're the same size. And then you're gonna taper one side a little bit more. So it's just like a little raindrop, okay? If this seems too big when you push it in here, mine seems a little big. I'm gonna make these just a little bit smaller, I think. And then what that's gonna do is sort of fill in any gaps. So I'm just gonna kind of push that raindrop down in there. And I'm gonna do that anywhere I see kind of space or air in my snail pattern that's going around. So again, thinking about a pattern. So if I put one here, I've got to put it in that same space all the way around. Once I get a nice row, I've got my first coil in there, I've got a row. Notice that it's pushing, I'm pushing this to the outside edges. So it's kind of taking on the shape of the form. I'm going to do my raindrops all the way around, and then it's time to blend. Before you blend, just check, make sure you've got raindrops everywhere they need to be. And then it's a really fancy tool, people, just your thumb, get in here and start to pull down. So you kind of are blending down and pulling that clay down, maybe a little bit to the sides, but I start by going down. And then start to blend around. Now, again, I'm using this form, I'm pressing against this metal bowl to help me to blend this evenly. And I'm not being too worried too much. You know, kids are like, well, what about the pattern on the outside? Well, that's the whole magical part of this project, you guys. When you pull this saran wrap out, you pull your bowl out of the form, it's gonna be magical, right? You're gonna see all the cool pattern. You're erasing it sort of on the inside. Notice I did not slip and score any of those snails or raindrops. You're welcome. You don't really have to slip and score them because you're gonna blend all this. Okay, so that's really, really rough, right? I would do more blending. Another super duper blending tool that you definitely need to use, especially before you pull this out of here, is a nice wet sponge. So I'm gonna sort of sponge this, blending, blending, and it's gonna start to look pretty good. So just to cheat, just to kind of show you what's happening here, here is my row of snails. You can see, you can't really even see the raindrops really, but they're sort of peeking out there. And this is all blended together. Now what I have now is sort of a scalloped edge. Some kids like to keep that on the edge of their bowl, but I would encourage you to build your bowl all the way to the top of your form Then if you want to do a scalloped edge, you can continue to do that. Let's talk about another coil technique. We learned snails. Sort of a modified snail is what I call sort of the S curve. So again, I'm going to thin out my coil just a little bit, and then I'm going to start tapering one side and making a snail, but here's the deal. The other side of the snail is going to go the other way. So it creates kind of like an S. Now this is really pretty to do a row of as well if you're not feeling the snail. So this is sort of the S curve. So where's my cheat sheet here? We did the snail, that's kind of this one. The S curve is sort of that one. That's pretty. Let's talk about the rainbow. Rainbow's pretty cool. It starts with a raindrop in the middle. That's appropriate. So you start with kind of a ball, and then you're going to take your coil and sort of make an arc around that first raindrop. Oops, come here, little coil. Okay. Depending on how big your bowl is, can kind of determine how big your rainbow is. Like that would be a little bit too big. Oops. So that's the rainbow, and that can look really pretty as a row going around. Now your rainbow can face up this way. You could have a row going this way with like a finishing coil up on the top would look really nice. Or, you know, it could go traditional rainbow way, and then you'd have sort of a scalloped edge. So the rainbow's really cool. So that's this one, rainbow. Let's kind of set my examples there. Raindrops we talked about. Let's talk about the fence. Fence can go two ways. So a traditional fence is where you take your coil and you sort of go back and forth. It's kind of like a zigzag, I guess. I'm not sure why we call it a fence in ceramics land, but that's just sort of what it's called. So that's an example of a fence, and the fence can take up a lot of room really quickly. So for example, back to my bowl here, if I did a row of fence, I mean, it would have to be shorter than that, but you could see if I did one row of that all the way around, that would pretty much finish my bowl. So remembering, you have to use 3 techniques. Well, technically I did one that was just a straight coil. I did a row of snails for mine. So I need to pick one other thing to do. The fence can lay in this way or this way, okay? The last sort of thing I could do is I could kind of cheat. This one isn't really a coil technique, it's more of a slab technique, but I could go back to this extra slab I have. I could grab a cookie cutter and I could cookie cutter out like a row of hearts or something like that to go around, and those could get pressed in. If you're going to do a cookie cutter shape, it's important that the slab be the same thickness as the coil, all right? So that's not truly a coil technique, but that's another technique you could use. So going back to my example here, I've got to figure out what to do. I've got this scalloped edge, so now it's kind of like, well, what do I do now? So one thing that can fit pretty well with the scalloped edge to do next is the S. So, or I'm sorry, yeah, the S. So I'm going to do this kind of S curve and make one more band, a design band that goes around. I'm going to fill in this little gap here with some raindrops and get to the top edge of my bowl. Then I'll show you just some finishing techniques and talk about what to do after your bowl is built up and you've used all your different coil techniques. Okay, thanks.